You're listening to Voice of Israel.
Judy, Lash, Balint here on Jerusalem Diaries at Voice of Israel, starting another great week out of our studios here in Jerusalem. So those of us who live here are used to our children, our brothers and our sisters going off to their compulsory service in the Israel Defense Forces. Without them, Israel would obviously not exist. They are protecting the home front in every sense, and we love and respect them for their service. But did you know that there are thousands, literally thousands of volunteers who come from all over the world to serve for several weeks at a time in the Israel Defense Forces? Now, they're coming under a program called Sar-El, which is the National Project for Volunteers for Israel. And they are, in fact, volunteering not just for Israel, but for the Israel Defense Forces. So joining me to talk about this kind of amazing program is Pamela Lazarus, who is the coordinator here in Israel for the Sar-El program. Thanks for joining me, Pamela.
Thank you for having me.
So how did this program start? How is it that there are these thousands of people, and you can tell me how many there are, who are coming on a regular basis to join the IDF? How did that happen?
Well, first of all, we have about 3,500 to 4,000 volunteers a year who come to volunteer on this program. It was started in 1982 by General Aaron Davidi, who was a very, very famous paratrooper hero. Excuse me. A famous paratrooper hero in the Israeli army. And in 1982, during the Lebanon War, the country needed some volunteers to work on kibbutzim and fields and to sort of fill in when the men went off to war. So he sent some people off to New York City and told them, pass out flyers and see if you can get some volunteers to come to Israel. So that first program had a few hundred volunteers. And Davidi, who was beloved by everybody, thought it was going to be a one-time thing. And after those few weeks of those volunteers, people kept in contact with him and said, we want more. We want to come back. We want to do more volunteering. So Sar-El was founded in 1982, 1983, and it's been going ever since.
And how many volunteers have come between 1982 and today?
Wow. Probably, I can't even begin to say. Over 100,000 for sure. Yeah, over 100,000 for sure.
And they're coming from all over the world?
Coming from all over the world. The biggest number is actually sort of tied between France and the U.S. It's always a little competition between the U.S. and France. But we have people from over 30 countries all over the world. Amazing.
And they come and I know it's a big deal for them to come, and they actually get to wear an IDF, Israel Defense Forces uniform when they're here, right?
They get to wear a uniform. They work on the Army base from Sundays till Thursdays. They work in the logistics sections of the Army. Sar-El is actually a unit of the Logistics Corps Army, but there's a civilian side to Sar-El also. So our volunteers, although they're wearing uniforms, they're not really soldiers. I tell them that they're pretend soldiers, not real soldiers. And they are civilians volunteering on Army bases in various capacities, such as warehouses, working with equipment and supplies, communications equipment, medical supplies, filling kit bags that have all of the soldiers' uniforms and helmets and various supplies that they need to take out into the field. We have groups that work on a communications base. We actually have 3 different communications bases, and they work fixing the radio headsets that the soldiers wear when they're out in the field. So our volunteers are doing really, really important things, and things that reservists would often have to do, or other soldiers who now can be used, for other duties.
Right.
One of our most important bases, I'll have to say, is a medical supply base where our volunteers actually package, sort, get rid of old things, medical supplies that are used throughout the country on every single Army base throughout the country, and there are hundreds of Army bases, as well as whenever there's a natural disaster anywhere in the world. I'm sure your listeners know that Israel is one of the first responders, and these medical supplies also go all over the world.
So quite an important job. And actually, it's interesting. This whole thing reminds me, even though it's very different, but it reminds me of I saw part of a movie. I haven't seen the whole thing yet. It's Nancy Spielberg's latest film about the Machal, the Mitnadim from Chutz La'aretz, the volunteers from abroad who served here during the very formative years of the States. I don't know if you've seen that film, Pamela. Have you seen that? Pamela? I think we just lost her. Okay. I'm just going to talk for a minute about this film because it really is quite an amazing film. It's called, if I'm not mistaken, I'm just blanking on the name of the film, but it is a film about the pilots, American pilots who served in the 1947-48. And there were, I think, a couple of dozen of them who were American Jews who had served in World War II. They were trained as pilots. And they were asked to come, they were very young, and they were asked to come and fight and set up well, there wasn't an Air Force here, but they were sent to fly planes, and they were the ones who actually, it's an amazing story, they were the ones who took out the Egyptian army, the Egyptian Air Force, and without them, first of all, again, the southern part of Israel wouldn't have survived. The Egyptian army was 20 kilometers away from Tel Aviv at that point. And they were the first ones who really set up the Israel Air Force. And they too were American volunteers. So it kind of reminds me, again, on a very different level, obviously. Yeah. The volunteers we have today are not quite in that combat role, obviously. They're doing very different things. But the idea of people coming, to volunteer their services here is, I find that a very moving and very, it feels to me as an Israeli, something very reassuring.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I haven't seen that movie yet either. I've read a lot about it. The volunteers who came back then were called Machalniks. They were through the Machal program, which still is going on today. In a different way. Machal is mitnadvim, chutz la'aretz, so volunteers from outside of Israel, from abroad, and there is a program for young people who come from abroad and want to actually join the army, but they're not Israeli citizens yet, so they are part of Machal today. Right. And we get many of these young kids before they actually have their draft date into the Army, and they do Sar-El for a while until they actually are drafted.
So for the Sar-El program, let's differentiate here. For the Sar-El program, the National Project for Volunteers for Israel, what qualifications does one need to be considered to be a volunteer? How do you have to be very fit? Do you have to be a certain age? What qualifications apply here? Okay,
the ages are from 17 and up. We've had volunteers that are literally in their 90s. Some of our 90-year-olds are amazing, absolutely amazing people. You're not doing basic training, so you don't have to be able to run, miles and miles with heavy gear on your back. You have to be fit in that you have to be able to, walk a minimal distance. You have to be able to lift things if necessary, not heavy things. We have quite a few sedentary jobs on various bases. We use dozens and dozens and dozens of bases all over the country, and volunteers do not get to choose. We place them where we need them. A medical form is required from a doctor. there are certain medical requirements that are required, that are necessary. But in general, we have volunteers of all shapes and sizes and all walks of life. We've had volunteers from taxi cab drivers to Supreme Court judges who have been volunteers on Sar-El.
Now, this last summer, when we had Operation Protective Edge, the Gaza war, Israel here, we called up about 80,000 reservists. And after the war, I know there was a great need to kind of restore and refurbish a lot of equipment. That was done by Sar-El volunteers too, wasn't it?
That was done by Sar-El volunteers. We also put out a big call right after the war. A lot of people wanted to come during the war, and we did have a lot of people, but we told people we need you after the war, right? More than during it. And afterwards, we had hundreds of extra volunteers who came, and yes, they were put on bases where they were actually refurbishing the equipment that all of those 80,000 reservists went back and threw their gear down and then went back to their regular lives, and it was our volunteers who cleaned everything up.
So when we're just going to take a break. We're going to come back and we will be with one of the volunteers who is here currently for Sar-El. Don't go anywhere. Follow us on Twitter at VO Israel and go to Facebook and at Voice of Israel. Stay with us. We'll be right back with more great stuff from Jerusalem Diaries.
Any comments on Israel?
Tell them to get the hell out of Palestine.
This is Yishai Fleischer. On my show, you'll hear from Rabbi David Nesanoff, who captured Helen Thomas's infamous statements against Israel and the Jewish people.
My very life was transformed because a woman, the woman of the media, told the Jews to go back to Germany and Poland. I mean, how more anti-Semitic can you get? And she was feeding the world news. So sometimes they do it out of complete anti-Semitism, sometimes of complete ignorance.
That's the Yishai Fleischer Show, weekdays on Voice of Israel.
Deputy Speaker of the Knesset, Dr. Ahmad Tibi, on national security with Dan Diker.
These areas are occupied Palestinian territory. Sar-El will not stay as part of the State of Israel under Israeli sovereignty. It should be evacuated and transferred to Palestinian sovereignty.
Download our exclusive controversial interview. That's National Security with Dan Diker, weekdays on Voice of Israel.
Judy, Lash, Balint back here on Jerusalem Diaries at Voice of Israel. We're talking about Volunteers for Israel, Sar-El, those wonderful people who come and volunteer for the Israel Defense Forces. And we were talking with coordinator Pamela Lazarus before the break. And I just wanted to mention something, Pamela. I don't know if you know this, but we have had on the station here at Voice of Israel one of your most prominent volunteers named Brian Mast. Do you know him? Captain America?
Of course. I know him. I know all my volunteers, of course.
So he's one of our stars here, and we're actually about to talk to another star who has just started, I think, his third stint as a volunteer for Israel on Sar-El, Dr. Robert Fineman from Seattle, Washington. I know him as Dr. Bob, actually, is joining us here. And you have just started, Bob, your third stint as volunteers for Israel?
Yes, Judy. Good evening, and thank you for having me on the program.
So thanks for joining us. I know you're very busy, and you have a very busy schedule. Actually, what's a typical day like for somebody who is in Sar-El?
Well, it starts at about 7:15, 7:30 in the morning. There's breakfast. There's the raising of the flag. You have a few minutes break, and then you start working. I started yesterday, and I would say that about a third of the people, maybe 40%, are like me. We're stiff. It's not easy. It's not backbreaking, but you do a lot of work, and today was a full day of work, and it didn't stop until around 4:30 or 5 o'clock, and then dinner's at 5:45, and then there will be an evening event where we'll all get together and talk about something. But you do a lot of work. There's a ton of things that you can do here, and in this instance, it's working in medical supply, and we have boxes and boxes of medical equipment, all kinds of stethoscopes, blood pressure cuffs, IV equipment, all kinds of medications, and the job is to break down some of the equipment that's been around for a couple of years and upgrade it, or to create new boxes of equipment, not only for soldiers, not only for the IDF, but some of this equipment is used when Israeli doctors and nurses go to places where there have been earthquakes or typhoons or hurricanes or things like that. And when the doctors and nurses go, they take some of this equipment with them all over the world. And so it makes me really proud that we're doing something for all of humanity.
So now you are actually you are a retired physician and a college administrator. You've been here several times as a tourist, and this is your third stint as a volunteer for Israel. So what is it that actually motivates you to keep coming back and for this work job? As you said, it's not fun, it's work. What's
Well, it's fun because you meet some really interesting people, but it's hard work too. I've done volunteer work for Senegal. I've been to China half a dozen times doing volunteer work. I went to South America and saw patients as a volunteer. In the United States, I did a lot of volunteer work. It's just a lot of fun because you know you're helping people and you're meeting all kinds of very, very interesting people. I mean, there are people from all over the world who participate in Sar-El, and thousands of people. So you hear conversations in French, Hebrew, English, German, Spanish. I mean, there's some people coming from everywhere, and so you meet a lot of very interesting people, and you work with them, and you get to know them and talk to them, and it's a lot of fun because you learn things at the same time as you're doing things to promote, let's say, what I'm doing now, health and well-being, not only for soldiers in the IDF, but also I noticed I like to put if I could, I'd put a little note inside of some of these boxes that we put together with the equipment and the medications and say, these were put together by Sar-El volunteers from all over the world. And people should know that there's more to this than just helping soldiers. There's helping people from a lot of different places. And I'm real proud that Israel does that. They send doctors and nurses wherever they can be helpful for meeting the needs of people, let's say in the Philippines or in Haiti or wherever they go, and they take this equipment with them.
And what about, are you getting contact with people who are regular soldiers in the IDF?
We do. In the previous experiences that I had at other bases where they were training paratroopers and things like that, we had even more interaction with the soldiers, and that was a lot of fun to learn about them. At this base, it's not the same. This base, a lot of the soldiers come here and work during the day, and then they go home to their families in the evening, more so than at the places where I worked at in the past. But we do talk to them, and the most amazing thing happened this morning. We were in one of the buildings and getting all the supplies in these boxes and things, and there were a bunch of ladies who were there. They were bussed in. They live in and around this base. They had breakfast. We talked to them. Then they sat around the table, packing all the boxes with all the medications and the bandages and everything. They had lunch in the dining room, and then they went home. Now, these are people, they're mostly ladies. There are a few gentlemen. These are people in their 70s or maybe some in their 80s. And they are Sar-El volunteers, and they do a lot of the things that we do. They stay for a half a day, but they want to do something for Israel, and they want to do something for humanity. And so they come in, and each morning, a different group of women, and mostly women, those 60, 70, 80-year-old individuals come in, and they do the same thing that we do, but they sit around a long table, usually about a dozen, 6 on each side, and they help pack the boxes with all the equipment and the medications and things. And I mean, they want to help.
Right.
And,
now,
unbelievable.
How do your friends at home react when you tell them you're going off to serve as a volunteer for the Israel Defense Forces?
I think they're proud, just like I am.
Your Jewish friends and your non-Jewish friends? Is there ever any...
Well, and remember that in Sar-El, there are a lot of non-Jews, too. I mean, not everybody who participates as a volunteer is Jewish. There are other people who come, and in the past, I've seen a lot of this. People from South America who weren't Jewish, people from Australia, South Africa. And no, a lot of people know about this program, obviously, and obviously you don't have to be Jewish to participate.
Right.
You just have to want to help people.
Right, Judy. And one other thing I'd like to say is that out of all of our volunteers, more than half of them are repeat volunteers.
Like Dr. Bob.
Like
Absolutely.
Dr. Bob, absolutely.
So, Bob...
there's one lady here who's done it more than 50 times.
Yeah, you're not going to achieve that one.
She's like the great-grandmother. She's like the great-grandmother of Sar-El.
Right.
I talked to her, and she's phenomenal. And I don't know how many times, but it's 50-some-odd times. And there are others who have been here 20 times and 30 times and things like that.
Now, I have to ask you, how is it to take direction from an 18-year-old, what we call a madricha, your soldier leader, your female soldier leader? How do you react to that?
Aye, sir, or ma'am. Some of them are women, some of them are men. And Judy, you know the story about the Mazraha that we had when I was the first time in Sar-El with my wife in 1999. And we told her that when she finished her Army experience to pack a suitcase, put a wedding dress in it, and please come to the United States and stay with us because we want to introduce you, this woman, who was about 19, to our son. Of course, he wouldn't have anything to do with her because the parents should never in the United States, obviously, try to make a match. But this woman came and stayed with us when we were in Seattle. She lived with us for a year, went to the University of Washington, and she made the match between my daughter and my current son-in-law and my daughter Amy and her husband, and they have had 4 grandchildren. They live around the corner from us. So Sar-El had more than just a military or humanity experience. It affected our family forever.
Right. Now, we just have a minute or so left, but Bob, what advice would you have for those who might want to consider a stint as a volunteer in the IDF?
I think they'll love it. It's a mind-changing, now because of all the hard work, body-changing. I'll be stiff for a couple of days, I'm sure. If you want to do things for not only Israel but for humanity, this is a great way to do it. You meet some really fascinating people. There are other doctors here, lawyers, people you can talk to and have a very enjoyable conversation. And I would say, hey, listen, if you want an experience, if you want to meet the soldiers and talk to them about, the things that go on in their lives and our lives, my life, this is a fabulous experience. And you get real close. I mean, you can't get much closer than being on the same base at the same time with all these different people.
Right.
Definitely, Judy, it's definitely one of the best things I ever did in my life. I did many, many, many programs before I made Aliyah, and most of my volunteers say it's the best thing they've ever done in their life.
That's what I
agree.
That's what I keep on hearing. And again, we could not manage here without the support of the people who support the IDF. Is essentially what you're doing. You're doing things that nobody else could do. Now, what is the website if people want to get more information?
Okay, for people in the United States, they would contact Volunteers for Israel. info@vfi-usa.org. And if they want to just look at the Sar-El, Sar-El is the umbrella organization for all of the various countries. If you want to look at the Sar-El website, www.sar-el.org. I'll be happy to help anybody with any questions.
So Pamela will even meet you at the airport, of course.
Meet everybody, of course.
And that's how you know all the thousands of volunteers. So again, Dr. Bob Fineman, thank you so much for being here and for being with us on Voice of Israel. Pamela Lazarus of Sar-El, thank you for joining us. And for more great shows, be sure to visit voiceofisrael.com. Follow us on Twitter at VOIsrael. Let us know what you think. And any questions you have, go to our Facebook page at Voice of Israel. This is Judy Lash Balint signing out from Jerusalem Diaries.
You are listening to Voice of Israel, premier news talk from the heart of Jerusalem. To listen to more great audio, register for our live streaming broadcasts at voiceofisrael.com. Voice of Israel, bringing Israel closer.